Hey guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here. Congrats on hitting your final Ed Puzzle and chapter quiz. I'm here to discuss the foreign policy initiatives under Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Just to give you kind of an overview before I dive in, both presidents really deal with the same themes. Number one, a very tense relationship with the Soviet Union that eventually turns into a friendlier relationship with the Soviet Union that eventually signals the end of the Cold War. But at the same time, both presidents do deal with conflicts in the Middle East, which, as we know, is something that continues past the 1980s and early 1990s. So we're going to start with Ronald Reagan, who served 2 terms in office. And when he ran for the presidency, one of his foreign policy initiatives was to restore the United States and its reputation as a global superpower, and also build up our military arsenal. And to begin with, he's really known for kind of redefining our relationship with the Soviet Union. At first, he takes a very hard line against the Soviet Union, referring to them as an evil empire, which are definitely fighting words. And he's prepared to use military force to back that up. One of the things that he also implements is he implements a huge increase in military spending. In fact, it's one of the largest peacetime military budgets in history, reaching about $300 billion to not only building up our Navy, but building up our nuclear arsenal. And an example of how that money was spent was through the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was known as Star Wars by its critics, because he proposed a series of lasers and particle beams in space to stop and or destroy enemy missiles. And so that's kind of the start of his presidency. On top of that, he is, like past presidents, very committed to defeating communism around the world, particularly in Central America. And so during his presidency, he deals with something that turns out to be a huge political scandal known as the Iran-Contra affair. So in Nicaragua, in 1979, the Sandinista Marxist government overthrew the dictator and implemented themselves in place. Starting in 1981, the United States began sending aid to the Contra rebels who were trying to overthrow this communist government. How did we do that? Well, at the same time, the countries of Iran and Iraq were at war with one another. So we sold weapons to Iran and then used the money from those weapon sales to help fund the Contra rebels in Nicaragua. Now, this went on for quite some time, but in 1985, the Boland Amendment had been passed, which made helping the Contra rebels and funding those rebels illegal. So, by continuing to help them, this was in fact considered an illegal action. In 1986, there was an investigation, and many of Reagan's aides testified before Congress. And again, this is known as the Iran-Contra affair, selling weapons to Iran, giving that money to the Contra rebels who were trying to overthrow the communist government. The question also was, how much did Ronald Reagan know? Did he know every detail of what was happening? And after quite some time, it was believed that he knew of the sales to Iran, but did not know of the diversion of funds to the Contra rebels. Long story short, this is a bit of a scandalous blip on his radar. He does take a little bit of a hit in the polls, but he does bounce back from that. On top of that, there's some instability in the Middle East, and this is another issue that Reagan deals with in his presidency. So in 1982, Israel had invaded South Lebanon to stop an organization known as the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization, from invading Israel. Reagan sent in some peacekeeping troops to try to maintain stability in the region. But after two very tragic events in 1983, the first being a bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon, which resulted in the deaths of 63 people, and then a bombing on our Marine barracks, which resulted in the deaths of 241 of our soldiers. Reagan eventually pulled those troops out of Lebanon. As the 1980s progressed, though, there is some good news, and Mikhail Gorbachev takes office in the Soviet Union in 1985. And he's very different from his predecessors and implements two, I guess you could say, policy programs that signal that there is a change happening in the Soviet Union. The first one is perestroika, which means a restructuring. And in this case, he begins to restructure the Soviet economy to make it more of a free market economy. He also implements something known as glasnost, which is openness. And in this case, he believed in an openness and a transparency in politics and elections. So knowing that Gorbachev is a little more open to, sitting down with the United States, both he and Ronald Reagan meet several times, and they begin pulling weapons out of their nuclear arsenals. Gorbachev also commits the Soviet Union to leave Afghanistan, which had been something that was a bit of a conundrum for the United States and something that we very openly were against in the late 1970s. So this signals kind of a thawing of relationships, if you will, and it signals the beginning of the end of the Cold War. In 1989, East and West Germany are opened and the Berlin Wall is torn down. By 1990, the Soviet Union had been broken up. Many independent countries were formed as a result, and the Soviet Union transitioned into what we know it today as Russia. So when George H.W. Bush takes office, again, he served as Reagan's vice president. He actually was pretty savvy. He surrounded himself with a very strong foreign policy team, and he's able to kind of build on the end of the Cold War throughout his presidency as well. One of the first things that he does is he signs the START I and START II treaties, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties. And the first treaty, which he signed with President Gorbachev, allowed both the United States and the Soviet Union to reduce their nuclear arsenal to about 10,000. And then START II, which he signed with Boris Yeltsin, decreased that even further to 3,000 weapons. So that continued thawing of the Cold War and an improved relationship of the Soviet Union does occur under Bush's presidency as well. His biggest foreign policy issue comes in the Middle East with the Persian Gulf War. And so this actually began in 1990 when leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, invaded neighboring country of Kuwait, essentially to control oil fields and what he believed to be land that initially did belong to Iraq. President Bush tried a lot of different tactics. He tried freezing the assets of Iraq and Kuwait. He tried economic sanctions, and then eventually gave Saddam Hussein an ultimatum and a deadline to leave Kuwait. When he did not meet that deadline, on January 17th, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began, and we, as the United States, along with 28 other nations, began a series of airstrikes against the Iraqis. And the airstrikes as a kid, I remember actually seeing all of these on television. It was kind of crazy to watch. But in addition to that, we sent in about 500,000 troops, and there were essentially only 100 hours of fighting on the ground before there was a ceasefire, a halting of fighting on February 27th. So this was a very short conflict. But as you know, Saddam Hussein will continue to be an issue for President Bush's son, George W. Bush, in the early 2000s. Okay, guys, I think that wraps it up for foreign policy. Again, you've got continued tensions with the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and trying to maintain stability in the Middle East that occur under both presidents. Hope you guys have a great day.